Welcome to the 12th episode of the Right Cast. Now, I told you guys, or I mentioned at the end of the last episode, that my background would not be this Buddha, but as you can see, I was lying. I was lying. I was not lying, but unfortunately, things did not go according to plan because apparently hotels and Wi Fi do not really work. They're not a great combination. So it is what it is, at least not the hotel I was in. So that's just how it went for the last 2 weeks. Anthony, as you can see, his background did change. So he was
Yeah,
not
I
lying.
did not lie. I got a haircut and moved 300 miles.
Yeah. So things is different on his end, which is nice, very interesting. There you go. You've got at least on this side, you've got something different to look at. You know, Buddha's still goated, so it is what it is. We'll just deal with it. But as you can see today, we want to discuss a topic which I think will be very relatable for many of you, which is to do with relatability in stories. Okay, how important is it to have characters and stories that we feel are relatable to us? Especially in this day and age, I think that is actually something that I think a lot of people bring up a lot. Again, going back to some of our previous topics we've covered, like diversity and cultural appropriation, things such as relatability are often brought up in those conversations, and how relatable a culture is, or a character is, or a person's race is, or identity, and yada yada yada, because that is something a lot of people focus on. So I thought it'd be good for us to kind of zoom in on that specific topic. Well, I say I thought, no, I did not think. It was actually Anthony who thought that. Sorry, let me not try and still. Anthony's the one who thought that. That would be a good idea. So, since I'm saying that, Anthony, would you like to give us some reasons as to why you thought this would be a good topic to discuss, and what your personal thoughts are on it?
Yeah, so the major impetus for this is that when I see a lot of writing advice, and again, this channel, a lot what we talk about is writing advice, many authors kind of hone in on relatability. It's because many reviews, especially if you go in a place like Goodreads, bring up how much the people relate to the characters that they're reading about. And it's an interesting discussion because I know for me personally, I really don't care about relatability that much. And for me, it started when I was a teenager, and that's when I really got serious into reading books. Like I've always loved reading, but that was when I was reading like a book a week.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, some of my childhood heroes were James Bond, Sherlock Holmes. That's when I really got into Star Wars, stuff like that. And for all these characters that I were absolutely fascinated by, I never had this relatability with them. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not some sort of womanizing super spy like James Bond. I'm
Wait,
not
you're
some.
not?
Not with this hairdo.
Hey, it's not too far from Daniel Craig. I'm gonna. It's not too far. I watched this
Well, I
movie
think it looks
recently.
better on you than it does me. So,
Well, mine's a little different, but yeah.
but yeah, it's like Anakin Skywalker is one of my favorite characters ever. I'm not going to be murdering younglings anytime soon. And if I am, hopefully I stay out of the news for it.
No comment.
Yeah. But the point is that relatability has never been that important to me. And I do wonder how important it is to other people. Where you look at some of the highest grossing movies of all time, how closely are you really relating to a character like a Batman, a Iron Man, the Captain America, or even something like Top Gun Maverick was one of the top movies last year. Who's really having a personal connection of, oh yeah, I'm just like Tom Cruise and I can fly a fancy jet and save the day by blowing up some military installation. There's not a whole lot of relatability there. That's a movie that made $1.6 billion.
So I have a question for you in regards to that, and I have thoughts on the question you just asked. But first, I wanted to ask you. So you say that relatability doesn't matter to you very much, right? And you, all these childhood heroes you had, like James Bond and in Star Wars, which I would assume you liked Luke Skywalker, and you're talking about Anakin and stuff like that. So if you didn't personally relate to those characters in any type of way, and I guess this is leading, this is kind of me asking you the question you were just asking, but back at you. What is it about those characters then that made you like feel any type of connection, or did you feel a connection,
Mhm.
or what exactly was the significance of those characters in those stories to you then?
So for me, I think it's actually the opposite of relatability, where it's like I get to explore the story where I am exploring the world through someone's viewpoint that is completely different than my own. Like me and James Bond have a completely different set of morals, but me being able to see what makes a man like that tick is fascinating. One of my favorite TV shows of all time is Hannibal with Mads Mikkelsen playing Hannibal. And again, no one should be relating to him. But it's such a great TV show because it captivates you by putting you in the mind of a freaking cannibal. And so that's my argument that I believe that for many instances, relatability is overrated. And if you can make a character that's just fascinating to follow, you're going to have a more interesting story than trying to make a character that your audience relates to.
Yeah. So for me, I would say, to be truthfully honest, it's something like hearing you talk about it, it's making me think quite a bit, because I would say that relatability is something that I would think matters to me, or like in a sense of, I don't know if I'd say matters greatly, because it doesn't matter greatly, but it's something that I would say I appreciate when I feel like it's there. So if I'm reading a story or watching a movie and I see characters and I feel like I can relate to them, then it makes me feel a bit more invested, or I feel like I can appreciate that character a bit more, because of the simple fact that it's like, okay, that's similar to me, right? Especially if it's in an aspect that I feel like is underrepresented, as people would say, or like for example, there's like a personality trait or an archetype that I think isn't commonly shown, and I feel like, oh, I relate to. I remember years ago, there's this anime called Watamote, which is, it's funny, it's about a girl that's like really, really socially awkward or whatever. And years ago, like, which is crazy to think about now because it feels like a world apart. But there was a time I related to that anime, and I remember thinking like, oh, this anime, like I relate to this, feeling like a bit weird and socially awkward and blah blah. And watching that for me at the time was something that I felt like it was meaningful, because I was watching something and I felt like someone has made something and I can kind of relate, and I feel as though the experiences I'm having or how I feel as a person is being reflected in a story. And one thing that it did for me was it helps you, especially when you're in a certain mental headspace where you feel like you're the only person going through things, which again, I was a teenager, and in retrospect, I'm realizing that a lot of that was just some of the hormonal nonsense you go through as a teenager. Yeah. But at the time, you don't understand that. At the time, though, in the moment, and bear in mind, I was a pretty wise teenager, and even then, like I still was somewhat of a victim of that, right? Like I call it victim, but you know what I mean. Like I still was affected by that. So I point that out because, to be honest, relatability did help me during some tough periods in my life. Seeing characters that I felt like I could, like they were going through similar things to me, that helped me to feel like, you know what, maybe it's not just me. Because sometimes, like in your personal life, it's harder. I mean, there might be people you can relate to, or people who are meaningful, and even in that sense, relatability is important. Like even the stories of other people in your personal life, where they'll tell you things, and if you feel like you can relate to the story, it can be meaningful to you. And I'm thinking more in those kinds of senses. However, in terms of like necessity or whether it's needed, especially for me today, I definitely would say no. And one thing that you pointed out was to do with like characters, that like how likely is it people are really relating to them? Like when you think about some of these characters, especially characters who are highly competent, or just like in very specific skill sets that like almost nobody, no regular person has. I mean, the vast majority of people watching James Bond, yeah, they do not have the skills that they don't. All right. And I can assure you, even here in the UK, most British people are not James Bond. I promise you. Okay.
You would be taking over the world if that was true.
Hey, I mean, yeah, it's not. It's just not what it is. And so, but it's funny though, because I do think, and what I was going to say in response to you with the question of like, when you're saying how much do people value, or how, because what's the likelihood they relate? I think probably what that is it's not so much relating in terms of their actual lived existence, but more, or lived experience, I should say, but more them relating in a sense of an idealized experience. So it's like more what they wish they could be. I think a lot of these characters, they harbor, you know, characteristics and abilities that people wish they see in best version of themselves rather than the actual current, you know, present version of themselves. And I think that relates to what you were saying about looking at characters and experiencing something that isn't necessarily your experience. Now, in cases like Hannibal, the cannibal, right? No, maybe that's not necessarily something people idealize or want to become. But I think then that's the other side of it, is just seeing, because I've not watched Hannibal, but I'm willing to bet there's something in there that people will look at. Like, for example, there must be something in there that makes him an actual person, right? Like, so I don't know if he's got a family or something, but he must have something that's like part of the human experience. And it's seeing how a person like that can have those things. I think a lot of that is what makes people really interested in those kinds of characters. And it's the same reason why I think a lot of people watch serial killer documentaries and things of that nature, not because they necessarily want to be serial killers, but because they're just like, how interesting it is to see that someone like that who can do those kinds of crazy things can, you know, go to the nursing home and take care of their sick mother, or, you know what I mean? I think that fascinates people. So
yeah. So that brings up a question that I wanted to ask you. I think now is the perfect opportunity to do it. Where I was going to ask you about kind of the type of relatability that matters most to you. And the reason why I asked this is that this reminds me of some of the online dialogue that was coming out a few years ago, where Black Panther came out and was a monumental movie for a lot of people. Because while it's true that there were African American movies, African American superhero movies before that one, Black Panther was the first one on that scale. It was the first time that it was a true big money, big Hollywood movie with a predominantly African American cast for a comic book movie. But there was some interesting discussion going on where there were some people in the community that was like, it was hard for them to relate to the movie because even though they were seeing their people on screen, this was this hyper advanced, super rich, technologically crazy mythological society, basically. And so even though it was the same skin color, there wasn't a whole lot of connection there. Whereas around the same time, you had the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies. And so it was an interesting point that some people made that these were African Americans who were going to see the movie, and they were relating more to Spider-Man, who is this poor teenage kid, doesn't really know what he's doing with his life, who grew up in New York, compared to Black Panther, which is they had more physical similarities, but because the life experiences were so different, it was hard to relate. So I kind of turn the question back to you, and maybe whether it be your own connection to Black Panther or just kind of what is the relatability that you value most in fiction? Does the life experience matter, or is it more you just need to have a physical connection there?
So it goes back to what I said. There's relatability based on your personal experience, and then there's that I like idealized type of thing. I look at Black Panther as the idealized thing. There is no that Wakanda isn't real. It never was, and there's probably never going to be anything like it in the future. However, I think, especially for Black people, they need things like that. And the reason I say that is because everyone else has that. I don't see why, like, the idea that, like, it's annoying when the predominant media and imagery is slave movies and, you know, police brutalities. And this is the reason why it's always this hyper emotional thing where Black people always in their feelings. And yes, I'm saying it. This is the reason why. Because we're so often fed media that's always pushing at the same trigger points. See things that's not about that. And for me, as someone who likes speculative fiction, I don't want to see that stuff all the time. Like, to be honest, I don't really want to see it. It's annoying. I would rather see stuff that's more imaginative. Black Panther, to me, and I had my criticisms of that film, and I still do, including the second one. But at the end of the day, one thing I can say is that the way how I looked at it, and in fact, I actually remember, someone close to me at the time was writing a dissertation about representation media, and I was giving them a lot of my arguments that they use in their dissertation as well, to do with Black Panther. And one of the things I was talking about was about how, at the end of the day, it creates a precedent so that more things of that nature that maybe is more aligned to the representation, if you want to call it, that I want to see can start to happen. I would much rather see something that had like a Yoko Taro level of wackiness to it than Black Panther. But at the end of the day, Black Panther is like, if you think about the infancy of something, it's about right. In terms of what it's trying to do. In 10, 15 years from now, there will be more stuff that's got a bit more development. That's a bit, there's gonna be more range, and it's not gonna be that. I don't want to veer off to the question, but to me, it's all kind of part of it because that's how I think of it. I think when I look at Black Panther, that's how I think. I think of it in terms of the idealized thing and what it could potentially lead to, rather than just that one movie in all of itself. Because if I'm looking at that one movie in all of itself existing in a vacuum, then yeah, I'm not going to, like, let's just put it like this. Black Panther, and for as long as I've been a Marvel fan, has never been one of the heroes that has really been someone I cared about, was on my radar. Even within the film, I don't really care about Black Panther. Like, if I care, like, Spider-Man, yeah, is one of my favorite heroes. That's just the reality of it. He is. And yes, his character is a lot more interesting and he is a lot more relatable for myriad of reasons. So, but in terms of what he was asking to do with what type of representation or relatability is important, I don't know, because I guess what you're asking is it more like the racial one or the experience, right? Like my personal experience, because I may not share the same race as Peter Parker, but then my experience might be more similar to him than, say, T'Challa, right? So I would say, I don't know. I feel like the answer is both, but that's not really good because I'm looking at it as two separate things. To me, the Black Panther thing, I don't care about relating to that personally because to me it serves a grander purpose than that. I don't think, and I think the people, what I would say is that the people you're referring to in that dialogue who were saying, "Oh, I don't relate," I think they're missing the point because it's not about relating on a personal level. And if and to be honest, to do with this topic, that's actually an important thing now that I'm thinking about it. I think that there's some stories and some characters that are larger than life and serve a bigger purpose than, oh, I relate to them. At the end of the day, there's a lot of, like, if you look at, like, even back in ancient mythology and Greek times and Norse mythology, the average person who was following those myths could not relate to these gods, and you're not supposed to. The reality is that those are beings that are supposed to be bigger than you, better than you. But there are other stories of other characters who maybe are more similar to yourself, right? And how they exist in relation to those gods is what creates that synergy and relationship in the mythology. So I think people should take both those things. You should take the Peter Parkers of the world and the Black Panthers and whatever the world, and you should see how they kind of melt together. I don't know if I'm answering your question. I feel like
No,
I'm not.
I think I was curious to hear your perspective because, again, I'm not going to dictate what you should or should not enjoy in a work of fiction. If you go into a work of fiction, then and you want to relate to the main character and that's what you're looking for, good on you. That's not important to me. But I was curious to hear from your perspective as another writer, kind of like how much that matters to you, and maybe even how much of that do you now incorporate into your work because of what you believe when it comes to relatability.
Yeah, I definitely put it in my stories. That's for sure. Like, I can definitely say that because I want my audience to, because I know the power of it, and I want my stories to feel meaningful to people, and that's just a really simple way of making it feel meaningful. So it's that simple. Like, if I have relatability in a story of people feel that. In fact, even just yesterday when I was on my flight and I was coming back here to London, I was watching this film called Last Night in Soho, which is a British film, and it's all right, it's okay. But I was watching it, and there was one line of dialogue, just one line of dialogue, right, where this guy says, where this girl, the protagonist, asked this guy, she says, "Oh, do you have a car?" And he's like, "Of course I've got a car. How do you think I get from South London to North London?" I literally paused the movie, and my friend was sat next to me, and I said to him, I pointed to him, and you could read the subtitles, and we both just shook our head because I'm from South London. I live in South London, and I have lived in North London. You do not need a car to get there. That is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. And anyone who lives here knows we have something that London and the mayor in particular of London is always very loud and proud about, which is TfL, Transport for London. Okay, we have this great tube system and the buses that are iconic and all this. We have all this transport specifically so you don't need a car to get from one part of London to the other. So to see a film set in London made by British filmmakers with people writing a dialogue saying that was asinine. And so that's like it didn't ruin the whole film, but it's just like when we're talking about relatability, if I made the film, I would think about something like that because I know someone like me is gonna see that and be like, no, like bro, no, right? So in terms of relatability, I think about those little details, and I like authenticity. I like that if I, for example, like let's say where you live now, you don't obviously we don't have to talk about where you moved to, but just the place you moved to now, right? Or even the place you grew up in from your childhood and things like that. If someone made a movie set in that place, I think the more nuance and the more details they get correct, the more you're going to feel like whoever made that actually gave a damn about representing the place you're from. And even if it's not a necessity to you, I think it's just something that it's going to help. Now, if it's trash, like if the storyline's trash and the characters are trash, it's not going to do that much, right? But if it's a great story with great characters and it has those extra details and nuances that really sell you on the idea of, hey, this is a place I was in before and I can relate. I just think it makes it more powerful. I don't think you should, let me put it like this. I don't think you should put the relatability at the forefront to the point where other things in the story suffer. But I think that it's definitely something that if you put it in and you've got the other elements already solid, I don't see why not. It's only going to make people care more about the story. So I don't see why not.
And so that brings me to a point that I want to make during this discussion, where for me personally, relatability and something being true to life are two entirely different things. I think you can have one without having to necessarily relate to characters. But this is where I am a bit of a hypocrite, where for me, one of my favorite characters of all time is a character by the name of Joshua Graham. He is a major character in a game called Fallout New Vegas. And the reason why I care about him is because him and one other character in Fallout, a character by the name of Daniel, are to this date the only rock solid, amazing depictions I have of people of my religious faith. Like, out of everything I've read, played, engaged with, I have a hard time picking a character that is both good, fascinating, but also true to life and an honest depiction of people who belong to my religion. And so this might also be why I'm not.
This might I had to bring him up.
Yep. No. But this might be a reason why I don't care about relatability that much, because the things I care most about in life do not get depicted in entertainment. So what's funny is that I'm thinking I am a bit more of a hypocrite than I even thought going into this episode, because when The Mandalorian came out, there were a lot of memes online that were made about it, because there's actually a lot of crossover between the Mandalorian faith as it's depicted in the show and my religion. And this ties into the picture that you're showing. The Mandalorian has a line that's like, weapons are a part of my religion. And yep, that's true if you're LDS. John Moses Browning is to date one of the most well-regarded, innovative weapons developers of all time. The M1911 that he is holding in this picture was made by a member of my church. So maybe relatability is something I should give more credit for, but if there is something to be said for relatability, I guess it matters more in that it should cover the things that are really important to people. And maybe as a white person, I just don't care as much, because I do have so much white representation that just seeing someone's skin color doesn't necessarily make something relatable to me.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's definitely part of it, because if it's something you have in abundance, because then it's not going to be something that you're going to think about. Like, I don't think about, um like, if they show like a black gangster or a rapper or something, I don't really bat an eye. If you show me a black basketball player, I don't bat an eye, because that's so commonplace. But if you show me a black person who is actually got some ingenuity and is a scientist, or you know is into tech and is like actually competent at it, I mean, that's not something that you see a ton of. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, because it does. But you don't see it as frequently. And it's certainly not something that's put in a central respect. So the thing about movies like Black Panther, for example, is you see different archetypes of black people in one film, as well. So it's not just, and I think that that's something that's always going to have some meaning, because of the fact of what you just said, because it's not the norm, right? Which I don't. It is what it is. I don't care. Like, it's not necessarily going to be as normal, or as necessarily as normal as anyone else. But I think that, yeah, I think that that's always going to have some importance for that reason, and that's why it's important to a lot of people. I think that was something I brought up when we was maybe talking about the cultural. I think it was the cultural appropriation episode, and I was saying about how, like, because you're saying about being white, but then that's the thing as well. Even down to certain cultures, there are other white people where if their culture is not represented as much, and they see that matters to them a lot. Like, I brought up like example. I think of like Hungarian like Hungarian choir music. The Hungarian people, when they hit a lot, not all of them, but the ones who know that, they very proud of that. Like, yeah, that's my country, and blah, blah, because that's something that most people don't think of Hungary in terms of anything in terms of big, mainstream media. But ironically enough, a lot of the music from things like Ghost in the Shell and things of that nature that people say, oh, I love those chants. It comes from there. And so I think that on some level, no matter what, people are always going to care about relatability. And anyway, for the record, this guy, yeah, he's an amazing character. So I didn't know all that kind of stuff. I need to play New Vegas again. It's an amazing game. I don't know where you rank it in terms of the Fallout games, but I'm one of those people who puts it out there.
Oh, I think it's the best Fallout game by far.
Yeah, pretty much. Obsidian is what it is.
So for you, going by this discussion, you definitely care about relatability more in your writing than I do.
Mhm.
So I am curious, do you have any specific approach you take, or when you're planning your characters and your storylines, for example, do you like plan out specific moments of I want to evoke this specific reaction, I want to introduce this idea so that the audience can connect to this character better in this chapter? Or do you think it's just a byproduct that happens maybe either subconsciously or just happens by happenstance as you develop your story?
It definitely doesn't happen by happenstance, for at least usually, because I try to plan everything down to the most particular detail. So no, I definitely know if I'm trying to go for a certain effect, and I will typically do it quite deliberately. Um, Especially because, again, like, I want things to have that meaning to people. So I want someone to read a character and say, oh yes, this is what it's like. I can tell you right now, you know one character in my story, Parix, was not black originally. She wasn't. But like, and I'm going to be honest with you, looking at that in retrospect, from my perspective, that's weird. Okay, like the fact that Aurea, one of my protagonists, there was always those two that were going to be the main protagonists in that book. The fact that both of them would have been white is odd. Now, a lot of people might think like, oh, why? No, I think it does, because at the end of the day, I'm not adding anything different. I'm just doing, and the thing is that there's a lot of people when they write stories, like, this is the thing. Most of my characters anyway in my book are female characters. I'm not a woman. So I don't need to have the relatability in that direct way of like we're exactly the same thing. But at the same time though, in terms of like, I like subversion, I like doing things differently. I don't want things to be exactly the same. So why would I, and to me, part of that is imagery, right? Part of that is symbolism. I'm not someone who likes symbolism without substance, but at the end of the day, throughout all of history, symbolism has been powerful, and it does matter. It is something people use. And that imagery and seeing images, it is a powerful thing. And at the end of the day, even something as simple as seeing someone who looks like you in a certain position, whether people realize it or not, subconsciously, it does affect people a lot. So if I'm a storyteller and I'm making stories or I'm making media and I have the power to put certain images there, I don't see why I wouldn't, especially if I know it's going to people with a certain sense of relatability or whatever, and makes them feel a certain way. Now, of course, I'm never going to allow that to determine. Like for example, my story is a tragedy. I'm not going to be like, oh, I can't make it a tragedy now because there's black people. I don't care. Like, the story is going to be a tragedy regardless. But I think it's just, for me, I have the power to create whatever I want, any of these types of characters. So why wouldn't I just do that? Because at the end of the day, I am one of those number one people. I'm the biggest believer in doing for yourself and doing those things for yourself. I'm not about to sit here and cry because Disney's not giving me representation. I'm not doing that. And I've always told people to stop doing that. It's the reason why I start roasting about the Little Mermaid and these types of things. I don't want that. I don't. And I feel like I am entitled to say that because I will actually put energy behind doing those things myself. I will create my own characters that have that representation on relatability. I don't need a corporation to do it for me. You know what I mean? And I just think it's, personally, I think it's just sad. Like it's not necessary. Just yourself. I don't get it. Now, and I know not everyone's a storyteller, but in terms of what you're talking about, because the relatability thing does matter to a lot of people, that's fine. And again, I relate. I relate to relatability, man. So then I think more artists, more creators, they need to do that. But then at the same time, and this is the big thing, and this goes back, I'm pretty sure we brought this up in the diversity and all these other episodes, the quality of the story still needs to be there. It's not enough to just say, well, I've put some characters that represent X race or X sexuality or X gender or blah, blah, blah. Therefore, my story's good. No, you still needs to actually have the components of what makes a good story, because otherwise, as I've mentioned before in an older episode, you are actually you're it's a disservice to your supposed intentions, because what happens is the association becomes, oh, when you try and write for relatability, it turns into a bad story, or and then people start using that as fuel against doing that, or against trying to push that, or and it's like, well, we don't need that because it translates to worse sales, and people don't care about it. And it's like, just make it good. You know what I mean? Like, this is why, like, with the Forspoken, right? It's not enough to be like, we're a protagonist is different. No one cares. If your game's garbage, it's garbage. You get what I mean? And to be truthfully honest with you, I'm glad most people think like that. I'm glad that most people, when it comes to stories, do care more about the quality than, because there are a subset of people who don't. And I'm glad that they are not the majority, right? Because those people, if for them it's all symbolism over substance. And I said already, symbolism is powerful, but I think that substance is more meaningful. And the ideal is to get the combination of the both. You can have both. You can have the representation, the relatability, all that stuff, all the symbolism, all the imagery, and you can have the substance behind it. And I think for me, I'm sick of seeing the symbolism without a substance. So yes, I think relatability is important to me, because there's a lot of people who push relatability, but they do it in a way without substance. So I would like to think maybe I can not do that, right? So that's what I'd like to think anyway.
Cool.
But yeah,
and
I
that
think
kind of.
no, go ahead.
No, you finish your point.
No, I have no point. Trust me.
Okay.
No point.
Yeah, so I was going to bring me to, you've already kind of touched on this, but I was going to ask you, do you have any instances where relatability has actually hurt your interest or enjoyment of something? Where my example, this is my Brandon Sanderson shout out for the episode. I've mentioned how much I love the Stormlight Archives, one of my favorite fantasy series ever. The Rhythm of War is the latest book in that series. And not to go into spoilers, but the character arc of the main character Kaladin in that book was so personal and overlapped with an issue that I used to have in my life that it took away from me being able to appreciate and enjoy the book as much as I should have, because I did not want to think about or deal with the issues that the character was going through in the book. For me, it's like I put that part of my life behind me. I have overcome this. I never want to think about this again because I know it will be a problem if I spend time thinking about this. And so I really wish that Brandon did not waste, I'm going to say waste, because he spent so much time delving into this issue that I felt like if he spent more time talking to people that had this particular issue, they would have told him he went too far. You can describe the issue without having to focus so much time on it. So I'm wondering if you ever had a similar situation where you related to something so much that it actually hurt your enjoyment.
Not for a long time. And in my case, I think it was something that was very childish and petty. So it wasn't really, yeah. It was back during that time when I was watching things for relatability to help me with, situations I was going through. And there was some things I'd seen, like, well, there was one thing in particular, one anime, it was another anime as well that I'd watched. And yeah, it was a bit too close to home. And I just felt like, and I still watched it, but it was a bit too close to home, and it made me feel awkward. It made me feel weird. It was a bit like, oh, I don't know. But with the specific thing that my thing was anyway, it was so, I don't think it was like the situation you're describing where it seems like it was a lot more like specific. Mine was more like it was kind of similar, but not really. And to be honest, if I mentioned it to someone else, they probably wouldn't see what I was talking about. So it was more just me kind of projecting something into it. And yeah, that was harming my ability to fully enjoy the thing. Even so, actually no, to this day definitely not. But at the time, yeah, it was harming my ability to. And if I look back at the thing now, I'm like, how did I even relate to that in that way? Like, so I don't think it's the same as yours at all. I think mine was very specific to that particular moment in time in my life. But yeah, it's happened. Not for a while. Nowadays, I think if I looked at something and I related to it, I'm trying to think if it would bother me. I don't know. But it's definitely not happened recently. But I think it'd be very difficult for me to allow it to put me off, because I don't think there's many things in my life recently that I could. I don't know. Yeah, I would just say I don't know. I don't think so. Yeah, but in the past, yes. But yeah, I mean, yeah. Go ahead.
One more example I wanted to give that came up while we were discussing this is the TV show 13 Reasons Why. 13 Reasons Why was a very controversial show that showed up on Netflix, where it is the story of a teenage girl who committed suicide, and then a classmate finds all of her records and goes on this journey to find out why this girl committed suicide. And the show was so realistic and true to life in its depiction of what drove a girl to commit suicide that it led to a huge spike in suicidal thoughts and tendencies in the audience.
What?
So they actually had to not only add a warning, but do major edits to the entire series and cut down on episodes because of the spike. And so that would be my warning to people. There's actually another great scientific study that was done a couple years ago that listening to Nirvana leads to a spike in suicidal thoughts. And so to this date, scientists aren't sure if the reason would be because people know that the lead singer of Nirvana killed himself. That's what leads to the spike. Or if it's because of the mental case of someone who was suicidal at the time, created a product that is infused with his feelings, and that leads to a spike in suicidal thoughts for audience members. But that would just be my one warning to this episode, I suppose, for writers, is that there are certainly subjects you have to be careful about when making it relatable, because even though it might make your story true to life, there is certainly a danger in some things that you depict in your works of fiction.
That is a very interesting point that I did not think about. But I'm glad you brought that. That's a very, 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 very good point to make. Like, that is fascinating. I mean, like, woof. I mean, that is, yeah, because that's the power of storytelling. Like, that is the part. It's crazy though, because I mean, what can you really? So, like, how would you tackle that? Like, if you wanted to make a story about something like a suicide, then
Mhm.
then what? Do you make it unrelatable, or I guess like what you said, then the 13 reasons why, you just have to make it very, very clear. Hey, like, this is, do not do this, or, but I don't know. Does that work, or yeah,
So
I don't know.
it's a hard thing to tackle. So earlier in my book career, I wrote a story where it is about a girl who survived a high school shooting.
Mhm,
And a bunch of crazy things happen, and she decides to become a vigilante basically because of it. And so I was nervous about that book because that's a very sensitive topic. And so I reached out to a couple people online, try to get their input of finding people who had either been in that situation or is closely connected to someone.
mhm.
And the best answers I got is that yes, I had to make certain parts of that book completely unrealistic, where instead of depicting the school shooting, I did a dream sequence that was just surreal and over the top and was actually a bit more lighthearted than it probably even should have, to the point that there probably were readers who were offended that I kind of made the school shooting a little bit lighthearted. But that was better than making it so realistic that it I don't love the word trigger, but I think in certain situations it is an appropriate word where it was eliciting an emotional response that was damaging to some people. So that's the advice I would give. Make it unrealistic. Don't make it as true to life as you can, because sometimes making something raw is just too much for some people.
But then again, that is why trigger warnings exist, though.
Yeah.
So, to an extent, because to be truthfully honest with you, my thing is, whilst that is true, I don't like the idea of restricting people from creating certain stories because, like, it's gonna trigger people.
Yep.
So to me, it's the same way how, like, if you don't want your children to be exposed to certain adult content, then don't let them see it. That's
Mhm.
why ratings and certificates exist. So I think that with the trigger warnings thing, again, whilst it might sound like something people are like, oh, trigger snowflakes, but at the end of the day, I just think, just based on, like, if you understand human psychology, triggers are actual. It makes sense. They're an actual thing. I mean, they can be positive or negative, so I don't see why that's so crazy to people. But um, so to me, I think if there are warnings that, hey, this could, if you've gone through your experiences, these types of things might bother you. Honestly, I feel like that should be enough. And if you decide to still go into something knowing that, it is what it is. Because I don't see why, if someone wants to depict that in the rawest, realist way imaginable and just go all the way into the depths of it, why should they not be able to do that? Because someone might read it and then start feeling like, oh, now this makes me relive the experience. And I'm not trying to say that um to trivialize their experience, but at the same time, you got to be responsible. Now, if there's no warnings, then fair enough. You didn't know what you was getting yourself into. But I think that that's, in terms of responsibility on the writer or publisher, or any kind of creator, anyone who's distributing some type of work. I think it's definitely something to think about. And I would say that, like, think about, when you're making something and it has relatability, is it something that would require alerting your audience to potentially something that might affect them? Because that is a very, very important thing. And to be honest, I'm actually glad you mentioned that, because that is something I didn't think about. And but it is something that people have addressed already, which is why trigger warnings exist. So I do think that's important. And for me, I would just say that's how I look at it, as a solution wise. I don't think people shouldn't do it because of, like, oh well, it might upset people. It's like, no, put the trigger warnings and then let people be responsible with their own consuming of stories. You know what I mean? So yeah, but
Yep.
I think for this episode we've covered quite a lot of ground. I'm actually yeah, I don't know. I didn't know if we'd have as much to say about it, but to be honest,
Yeah, this was definitely one of our heavier episodes. I was not expecting some of the directions we took it.
yeah, but I think it's good. Makes it a good episode. So, um, do you have final thoughts, Anthony, on the topic or anything you'd want to say?
Um, no. The one thing I will add about trigger warnings is that I would personally recommend if you do decide to include them in your works. I initially did and then took them out because I figured I was just going to make my content easier to read for a general audience.
Mm-hmm.
I would recommend being more detailed instead of less detailed because this actually happened to me where it was about a month and a half, 2 months ago. Usually I just ignore trigger warnings, but there was some piece of content I engaged in where it's like, oh, that was a lot more graphic than I was expecting. And if you just went off of the trigger warning, it wasn't anywhere detailed enough to depict what happened. So,
Mm-hmm.
for certain works of art, I do think that you should have the ability to tell a story you want to tell, depict what you depict. But if you are going to take it to that level that's going to unnerve people, please take the time to actually be descriptive enough and make it clear this might be upsetting. You should really be careful if you fall under this category.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Don't
completely
treat it
agree.
like a joke if you're going to include one, because I've
Yeah,
definitely seen works of art that do that.
yeah, yeah. I completely agree, 100%. But yeah, I mean, I've said all I need to say for this episode, so I can leave it there. I hope you guys enjoyed this. This was the 12th episode of the Right Cast. Please let us know how important relatability is to you. Did you relate to this episode? But anyway, thank you guys for listening, and we're out.
Ciao.
Peace.